Nancy Sinkoff, the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner for the Center of Jewish Life, and I'm thrilled to welcome you back. Couple of things just to get us started. Once again, all of you are muted. The format again is a webinar where you are muted, but the chat is open for any questions you have, and you can ask questions going back to the first part of the course until today's, and we'll once again do a break about 20 minutes in to ask questions. I also want you to notice that in the chat for everyone is a PDF that's a 2-slide PDF with terminology and dates of much of the material that's been covered. So you can refer, you can have it, you can download it, you can refer to it today during the course and also going forward. I want to remind everyone that this will be recorded so you can view it later and listen to it later and share it with people who perhaps couldn't attend the sessions live, albeit remotely. As you all know, the Bildner Center is a cornerstone of cultural and intellectual life at Rutgers. In recognition of our 25th anniversary, I hope you will consider a donation to the center to ensure that we can continue to provide the vital resources on campus and for the wider public on Jewish culture, history, languages, and the dynamic aspects of Jewish life. Your gift enables us to make a meaningful impact in the community, fostering engagement with Jewish identity, culture, and history, and helps us be part of the larger vision at Rutgers to create a beloved community, a diverse and tolerant community. So please don't hesitate to support us in any way you can. We appreciate every gift. I've told you about the ground rules. Just remember that you are muted. Closed captions are available on your screen. You can click on captions where it says show captions CC at the bottom, or on the 3 dots, and that should give you access to the simultaneous translation of the oral presentation and help if there are any terms that may be unclear. Again, anything that is unclear, we welcome those questions. Okay, I think that we're ready to go. Once again, I want to welcome Dr. Avram Yoskovich, the Jerome and Lorraine Oresti Visiting Scholar at the Bildner Center this spring, and he will offer us now kind of a summation and yet new material in this very complex topic of Jewish apostasy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to all participants. I'm so glad to be here in the 3rd time, and unfortunately, at least on my side, the last time for this mini course. And we are going to see definitely some new materials. It won't be only a summary. So I hope the PDF, the file I attached to in the chat could be helpful for you along this meeting. And of course, I'm open. I'm inviting every question about any term or any idea that was during this talk. Okay, so let us start. The sharing works. In our first 2 meetings, we discussed apostasy in Jewish literature in detail, primarily from historical perspectives, but also from linguistic and semantic perspectives. Today, in our final session, I would like to focus on the ramifications of what we have learned. What is the significance of calling someone a meshumad, an apostate? What are the social ramifications of this term? What assumptions are made about the apostates concerning community, the observance of commandments, and personal responsibility? I admit, once again, that not everything has been definitely clarified. Nevertheless, there are some observations we can make on the basis of the sources which we have already seen, combined with some new sources which we will see in this session. We have already mentioned that geopolitical changes and the changing status of organized religion influenced the way people define themselves and the social and religious group. Now, I would like to discuss the philosophical underpinnings of the legal and emotional statements about apostates and apostasy. Sorry. As a reminder, let us begin by opening a window into the history of the Jewish apostates, a table tracing the evolution of the usage of the term meshumad throughout Jewish history. This table shows that in the earliest Jewish sources, the meshumad was viewed and treated strictly and with hostility. Later, in some sections of the Tosefta, which dates to the 3rd century CE, we begin to sense an attempt to create a legal framework for the apostates. But the greatest effort to create a conceptual framework for defining the meshumad was made in the Babylonian Talmud, a source that we will read soon. After the Bavli, the next stage in the evolution of the understanding and usage in the term meshumad was in the Islamic period. This was due to the common Islamic practice of Islamizing minorities. Non-Jewish texts also relate the concept of the apostates. I hope that we will have the time to read some more of these sources today. The Babylonian Talmud is a complex composition, not always easy to understand. And that was the reason why we haven't read it in this mini course yet. But today I will try to present it in as simply as possible. I will first give you some background material of this specific unit and then explain the text. The main speaker in this text is Rava, one of the dominant in the Bavli, of the sages in the Bavli. He lived in Mesopotamia in the 4th century CE, in a close proximity to the capital of the Sasanian Empire, Ctesiphon. Actually, he lived in a small town which was called Mechoza, that was on the west river of the, on the other side of Ctesiphon. And now, the source of the Bavli from the tractate Chulin, tractate that speaks about the kosher eatings, the kosher food and the rules of eating kosher food. And the Bavli says as follows: the above text stated in the name of Rava. Rava said, in the case of an Israelite apostate who eats carrion in order to satisfy his appetite, or his desire maybe, one prepares the knife and gives it to him, and then we may eat of his slaughtering. What is the reason for this? Because there is this possibility of both permissible and forbidden food. He would not leave what is permitted and eat what is forbidden. If so, should we not argue in like manner even where a knife is not prepared for him? No, for he would not go to any trouble. This Talmudic section refers to an earlier text from the Mishnah, which states that anybody can perform halachically valid slaughter, and that the slaughter is kosher meat permitted to be eaten. This means that there is a certain way to prepare a kosher animal for eating, and certain conditions under which the knife can be used to slaughter an animal. And after learning and practicing the ritual of slaughtering, any adult Jewish person, regardless of status, including women, is permitted to slaughter. Rava stated, perhaps as a commentary to this Mishnah, that the term anybody is authorized to slaughter also includes a meshumad, an apostate. But if this meshumad is known to be an eater of carrion, as eater of a carrion eater, which means that he doesn't keep the laws of kosher meat consumption, his slaughter knife must be inspected by another Jew who observes the law of kosher meat consumption before he may slaughter. If this inspection was performed by an observant Jew, then even a Jew apostate that eats carrion out of lust is permitted to slaughter kosher meat. In the ensuing discussion of Rava's statement, later sages try to understand why Rava gives permission to slaughter to somebody who is suspected of eating non-kosher meat out of lust? And the answer to this question, suggested by a non-identified sage, is that since we know that this person generally observes halakha, and he breaches the law of eating kosher meat only out of his lust for meat, when presented with the option of eating kosher meat or an unkosher meat at the same place and time, he would not choose the unkosher meat purposely. Only if there's no kosher meat will he eat non-kosher meat due to his lust. The next question of the Bible presents the opposite side. If he will choose kosher meat to non-kosher meat, so why can't we trust him to inspect his own knife? Now the answer is that this is exactly the point. He would not do any active effort since he's so lust, like preparing the knife properly, and he thus will make a wrong slaughter. That was the explanation of the section from the Babylonian Talmud. This short passage raises some questions and issues, but we try to focus the most important from a conceptual perspective. I wonder, where is Rava's statement coming from? What does it mean, the apostate out of desire? Who thought of the test of the apostate as a markering event? And did later sages accepted this test or rejected it? And what changes it went through? Before trying to answer some of these questions, I must say there are more two sources in the Bavli that cite Rava's statements in similar context, but are not identical in details. The conclusion I make here is based on the comprehensive analysis of the three sources, but I don't want to mess with two more difficult sources right now, so I leave it out of the slides. First and foremost fact is that Rava's statement is the first time in rabbinic literature we find kind of a subcategory for apostates. Sorry. Until now, namely, until the generation of Rava, not a single source related to Meshumad in a way that reflects subdivision of apostasy. All references were to apostates, in singular or in plural as it is. Linguistically, it is marked in Hebrew with the addition of lamed, of the le, translated to English maybe as for or out of, if we'll take it more freely translated. This addition means that while using the title Meshumad, we need to describe it using another parameter, which is what is the Meshumad he is Meshumad for, or for what purpose is he Meshumad. This addition is very meaningful. Sorry. Since it means that for the first time, Rava asks new question regarding the apostates, the question of purpose, of intention. Until now, not only everybody assumed they know what they mean while saying Meshumad and apostate, as we argued in the former meetings, but nobody asked him what for this apostate did his acts, in what context. If they were titled apostates from that point on, they were just considered as apostates. But now, Rava said, we need to relate to the notion of purpose and ask the question after we know, or after defining the Meshumad as an apostate, we have to question, what if he did it for his own desire? What then will be the result, the legal result or the social result? Checking somebody's intention or purpose can go to either side. It can shape different relationships with several types of apostates. It can also be very, very difficult to check. What is the intention, which raises a problem that the Talmudic discourse in this text addresses? What did Rava mean when he related to an apostate out of desire eating carrions? And what other opinions were possible about the phenomenon of desirous sinner? Before we continue to answer these questions, I have to note something else. Some of you may notice to the fact that there is something missing from this text and from our discussion so far. They would expect to be representative. There is another category, famous category of apostates. In Hebrew, we would say meshumad, meshumad leachis, meshumad out of spite, out of anger. The reason why I ignored this term so far is that simply Rava did not use this category, never. It is testified in the Bavli and related to sages lived 2 generations later than Rava. The sages are Ravina and Rav Acha. This information never noticed by commentators or scholars, and it changes the way we need to understand the development of these 2 terms, Meshumad leteavon, an apostate out of desire, and Meshumad leachis, which is an apostate out of spite. That they are usually considered as a couple or twin terms, but actually they relate to each other in different way. Actually, there are 2 different conceptions about apostate and its status that were not emerged at the same time in settings. As you can see in this slide, I reconstruct the development and I argue that the apostate out of lust or out of desire was emerged first in Rava's generation. And only later, at least two generations later, the apostate out of spite kind of made the binary construction of the 2 terms that kind of construct the apostates, the early apostates who was without any subcategory. Now, let us examine the notion about the desire which lies behind the sin. What Rava actually says is that if the sinner does a sin driven by an uncontrolled desire, it demands a further checking because his desire may influence his sincerity. The thinking about what drives the sinner is revolutionary. Nobody asked before this question. This is an interesting moment in rabbinic thinking, which scholars called it in other contexts as the mental turn. That means that at some point, sages like Rava began notice to the self, to the active agent, or to the subject. For us today, it may be sounds as no news, but if taking into account biblical Judaism and even later Judaism from the Second Temple period, the basic concept that people have to be judged according to their actual deed alone, by their acts alone. And their intention or will is not an issue at all. On the other hand, at some occasion, rabbinic and more specifically Talmudic thinking developed the notion about intention, at least as an optional category for estimating religious status of human activity. At this point, Rava, relating to this specific rule, reflects similar inclination. Suddenly, he requires to ask about what is the motivation of the evildoer, and according to that motivation, we shall decide how to react or what is the proper rule. But it was assumed for the first time regarding to apostasy that the question of what is the inner motivation is important and crucial. I think that at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe we will have some question before continuing.
So, Abraham, there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
Can you explain a little bit better the time frame where you see not the breaking off, but the beginning of this subcategory? Meaning, the earlier text you're saying have a general category of a mishumad, and then in the text of Rava, you begin to see some kinds of distinctions. Is that what you're saying here?
That was an exact description. Actually, and I on the timeline I showed that Rava lived in the end of the 3rd century and until the middle of the 4th century. So this is the time frame which I think we need to see the beginning of the subcategories. I can't say, I think that I wasn't the only one to point out this time frame relating the Bavli developing of subcategories. It is actually Rava, and he had his mate, his kind of a friend and colleague, Abaye.
His sort of his jousting, intellectual jousting.
Yeah, his chavruta, we would say in
right, his partner in discussion, but there's
and rival in a sense, an intellectual rival, and they both developed so many categories, earlier categories in the Bavli. So actually, after I kind of studied this specific units in the Bavli, I found out that the broader phenomena, the wider phenomena, is that it is actually just the same. That in each or many times when we check what Rava and Abaye did for earlier categories in rabbinic legal thinking, we found out that it was it kind of developed and sometimes get subcategories. So in that sense, it fits.
Okay, so another question that comes to mind, well, there are 2 questions. One is, how do you explain this? Meaning, why in this later or this sort of Talmudic mind do we see this process of intellectual subcategorization or something?
Mm-hmm.
And the other question, I guess, is in some ways the glaring question besides that one is, there's another Talmud, right? There's another group of sages who are debating the Mishnaic and the Tosefta. We have these earlier rabbinic texts created in the land of Israel, the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and then we have these 2 centers of the next generation of sages. So we have the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and they have the Yerushalmi, the Talmud from the land of Israel. Do we have categorization of subcategorization of apostates in the Jerusalem Talmud?
Okay, so these 2 questions are so big, I can say, or why? Yeah.
You only have 1 minute to answer both of them.
Okay, so it is the easiest.
I'm teasing.
It is easiest to do. According to the Yerushalmi, to the Talmud from the land of Israel, apostate exists, and they speak about it, and they kind of develop developed it in legal senses, and even in other senses. Like there are some 1 or 2 narratives concerning an apostate, but it was never developed to the level of having subcategories. And the subcategory is a level of a really theoretical, scholastical activity, which the Yerushalmi, the Talmud from land of Israel, is generally is less exceptional in that sense than the Talmud from Babylonia. So we have material on apostates in the Yerushalmi, but it's not different meaningfully from the earlier sources. That is the reason why I didn't brought it here. And what was the first question?
No, it was about influences, but I want to take a question from the chat. David Goldfarb asks, if he gets it right, Rava uses the term mumar, ochel nevilot leteavon, that's the Hebrew, or mumar and meshumad, one and the same. So these 2 terms, just for everyone who doesn't know the Hebrew, there seem to be 2 terms, and the question is, are there synonyms or are there distinctions between?
No, I kind of sending you to the last minutes in our in last week's session, because the question was just the same. And every single rabbinic source today we read in books is presented as mumar many times. But in every single occurrence of the word mumar in rabbinic literature, the word was meshumad, and it was changed only since the end of the 16th century. So for 1,000 years or 1,500 years, the word mumar wasn't exist, and for that reason, I'm not relating right now to the word mumar. In another session in the future, if Nancy will invite me, I can speak about the relations of or the reason why mumar replaced the word meshumad, etc. and so on. But it belongs to the history of the word in the middle of the late Middle Ages in the 16th century. So, but the source says has meshumad, and mumar is an error actually.
Okay, so Professor Yoskowitz, we're going to have to later on discuss a fourth session to talk about mumar. But right now, one last question before we move on. Joe Rosenstein asked, when does the idea arise of an apostate on intellectual grounds? I think that's the intentionality. The apostates in the later period were also dealing with social issues. So can you make a distinction between the category of an intellectual apostate versus a social apostate, or you know, do they go hand in hand?
As far as I understood the question, that I think that we cannot separate these two levels of apostasy. Actually, there was no an intellectual apostasy at all in earlier times, as far as I can see it, as I read the sources. And the issue of apostasy is always connected to social or combined by social terms and intellectual or religious theological terms. I cannot divide between these two levels, at least not in my sources for right now.
Great. Okay, thank you. So you may continue, and the rest of us will mute and stay.
I will share just a second. Okay. Let us continue. I want to stress at the beginning of our second part now, that Rava, in the section from the Bavli we just read, didn't say explicitly what is the moral function of desire. Is it making the evil act less severe, or is it make it more severe? I think use it practically, depending on occasion. What is the specific situation? Since he spoke only on a person who has craving for eating meat, it can influence badly on his slaughter. On another source, he considers desire as a reason to act more softly toward apostates by the sages. So it can go to both sides. But now I want to ask you, what do you think about desire? Once again, I cannot, I'm sorry, of course, that I cannot have you all involved, but try to answer yourself. What do you think? If someone does anything only out of spite, for their uncontrolled anger, or as a rebellion, is it the worst behavior? Or if this person is doing something because he is or she cannot stop themselves from doing something like stealing or desecrating Shabbat, would you think it is the most wrong act because the drive is only desire? I want to show you few sentences by other thinkers from ancient times regarding this question. Some of you may know, for some reason it doesn't go forward. Okay. Some of you may know the Alexandrian thinker Philo, the Jewish thinker and writer, who lived at the beginning of the first millennium. What does he have to say about emotional behavior? And I'm reading from the slide. One may see that those who forsake the holy laws of God are intemperate, shameless, unjust, disruptible, weak-minded, quarrelsome, companions of falsehood and perjury, willing to sell their liberty for luxurious eating, for strong wine, for sweetmeats, and for beauty, for pleasures of the belly and of the parts below the belly. The miserable end of all, which enjoyment is, ruin to both body and soul. Philon's words include with the worst sinners and evildoers those who are addicted to the desires, who cannot control the lust for food and eros. And he sees this inclination as causing damage to both the body and the spirit. If we try to speculate what Philo would think about subdivision of an apostate out of desire in comparison with just regular apostate, I would guess, based on his words, that the sinner out of that desire is the worst moral status, even if we compare it to someone who does deliberately out of rebellion. Even if you won't agree with me about Philo, according to Hellenistic common view, which is the philosophic tradition Philo belongs to, the dichotomy between anger and desire is more blurred. Since we would say, to my opinion, the anger is virtually an emotional situation originated by an unbalanced and uncontrolled desire. A similar opinion, but much clearer and claimed explicitly, is the saying of the Roman emperor, philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, who lived in the 2nd century CE. He used the following words. In comparing sins, the way people do, Theophrastus says that the ones committed out of desire are worse than the ones committed out of anger. I'm skipping a few lines, and then he said, the angry man seems to turn his back on reason out of a kind of pain and inner convulsion. But the man motivated by desire, who is mastered by pleasure, seems somehow more self-indulgent, less manly in his sins. Theophrastus is right. The sin committed out of pleasure deserves a harsher rebuke than the one committed out of pain. It's true that Marcus Aurelius cited a Greek philosopher, Theophrastus, who lived much earlier. He was one of the Aristotle's great students, actually the leader after Aristotle's death. And he lived 500 years later, before Aurelius. But Aurelius is convinced by this opinion. We can call this the Stoic attitude toward pleasure, and it was definitely present in Roman world atmosphere at the 2nd century CE. The claim by Marcus Aurelius explicitly says that there is a gap between desire and anger, and that anger as urging cause to do a sin is less severe than sin out of desire. The reason is probably that the Stoic school considered the material body and all its periphery as the worst pole of reality, as pure irrationality. As I hinted before, I think this is the claim sitting in the back of Philo's list of the worst evildoers, including the people who don't control their lust. After reading these sources, it is clear that Rava's opinion is not obvious. It was a new idea, or at least new idea to Jewish sources, that has some background in earlier halachic sources, but its shape, implication, and usage are innovative. The reason for that is that Rava suggested a solution to earlier sources that were, and by this I kind of answering to your question, Nancy, about the influence, or what reasons could be for this kind of development. It Rava suggested a solution, an answer to earlier sources that were in contradiction with one another, by implying the notion of an apostate who acts out of desire, and this a reason to relate to apostate in more inclusive way. Rava harmonized two other sources from early Talmudic layers and make a reform in the relation to somebody who sins but due to his lack of self-control. Actually, Rava's statement works on two different conceptual levels. Excuse me. It innovates two notions. The first is part of a broader innovation, as I said, and it is the turn to the agent, to asking questions about the inside element of human activity, and not only judging the reality based on acts or results. The second notion is specific to our subject, and it is the possible division between different kinds of apostates. And by saying that one who does out of desire can be treated more easily, since from moral perspective, it is not that severe as a rebellion or as provoking. In the last chapter of this meeting, and actually the whole mini course, I want to explore the way this Jewish internal development is reflected in non-Jewish sources by using two examples taken from very different sources and cultures. The first case I would just kind of describing briefly is about Syriac Aramaic development in the semantic of the root Shin Mem Daled. As I said, I reminded that the first meeting, I claimed that the root of the Hebrew word Meshumad actually is coming from an attested root in Aramaic, of earlier Aramaic, Shin Mem Daled, the three letters that construct the word Meshumad, which means a ban or a curse in Aramaic. Syriac Aramaic is one of the Aramaic dialects that was spoken in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, in the Middle East, during or between the 3rd century CE, at least to the end of the millennium and maybe later. And on the slide, you can see one manuscript of questions and answers in Syriac. And this dialect or this language was spoken and very dominant in the Mesopotamian atmosphere in the years of the Babylon Talmud, and later the Gaonic literature was created. So Christian Aramaic or Syriac Aramaic has the word Meshamdo, which is just the same word as Meshumad in Hebrew, which means sorry, someone who excommunicated from the church, or a ban, or someone who is Meshamdo is a curse, and Meshamdo is someone who was banned or was cursed. So it's very similar to the earlier level of the Hebrew word Meshumad. But since the 5th century and later, we find the word Meshamdo in Aramaic, or other similar forms of the word Meshamdo in Syriac Aramaic, in another meaning, a negative meaning, but different. They use it to signify the meaning, semantics of lazy, or some last, or someone who full of desires. This change is very interesting because it is parallel to the change Rava just made to the Hebrew term Meshumad by adding the words out of desire, the teavon, to combine with the word Meshumad, which means just the same. These words express exactly the same meaning as the Syriac since the 5th century. But since Rava lived a century century earlier than these Syriac texts, we can speculate that after the word assimilated in Jewish Hebrew and in Jewish Aramaic, it was perceived by their neighbors, the Christian neighbors, speakers of Syriac Aramaic, for the same word, but in a new meaning. Of course, as always, when we speak about influence, we have no, there is lack of something like we would say the smoking gun. It is hard to show it very, very clearly, but the combination of the facts here make me to believe that this construction is solid, is reasonable. But now I want to continue to another case, which is highly interesting for several reasons, and I want to share the text with you. The text is attributed to a person who was called Ibn Khawkal. This piece was written in Arabic by the Muslim geographer Ibn Khawkal, who lived in the 10th century CE, and he contributed to Muslim geography by describing places in the world and their habitants. You can see on the slide a map, or a map which is based on his map as it is presented in his Magnus Opus, about, I think it was called, about the roots and the people of the world, or something like that. Ibn Khawkal, his name was Ibn Khawkal al-Nasibi. He came originally from the city Nisibis, today's Nusaybin in southern Turkey, which is very, very close to the place that the earthquake happened 2 days ago in South Turkey. And Nusaybin, or Nisibis, was a very important center for Christian intellectual life, later to Muslim intellectual life. And later he studied in Baghdad, the great Abbasid capital and intellectual center for Muslims, Christians, and Jews during the 8th century and later. In this section, which I'm going to present you, he described the place Sicily and its inhabitants, and he says as follows: most inhabitants of their fortresses, rural areas, and villages are mushamidun. I have seen that they enter into marriage with Christian women, which leads to the boys being assigned to their fathers as al-mushamidun, and the girls becoming Christian women with their mothers. They do not pray. They do not perform acts of ritual purification. They do not give alms. And they do not go on pilgrimage. Some of them fast in the months of Ramadan. This practice is a curiosity they do not share with anyone else in the world, and is so many places in the world. And with this trait, they have won the trophy in the race of stupidity. I think, if I may, this text is hilarious, to my opinion. Ibn Khawkal tells us about mixed families of Christian women and Muslim men, and the descendants are called in an unknown word in Arabic, el-mushamidun. He says that these mushamidun are not so positive believers, since they do not keep the Islamic commandments, besides one in only partial way, which is the fast of the Ramadan. For that behavior, it chose the amusing sentence, the winning the trophy in the race of stupidity. This description is important for Christians and Muslim relations history, for religious history in Sicily and Europe, and so forth. But since our time is running out, I want to underline here one interesting point connected directly to Jewish apostates and the relation of other religious groups. The very name Musha'amidun is not an Arabic name, and no Arabic etymology or explanation was suggested to this word. Only recently, a scholar who published this text in the name Teresa Yake understood it correctly as originated from the Hebrew word meshumad. I think it is more interesting than just pointing out the similarity, because the way the word is written in this text in Arabic reflects certain tradition in Jewish commentary about the origin of the word meshumad, a tradition that is attributed to the 11th century Jewish Babylonia, which is just the place Ibn Khawkal gained his academic knowledge. So the relation here to the Hebrew intellectual atmosphere is connected very, very well. If this is true, it is a really interesting case of how language and concepts transferred and developed in many ways and channels. Here, the word for apostates came to Hebrew through Aramaic, and later it influenced on Syriac Aramaic semantic. And at the end of the millennium, it penetrated Arabic from Hebrew or from Jewish Aramaic to denote people who live with their other religious spouses while disobeying the commandments. I couldn't make it. I couldn't invent it, I would say. This is a real irony of history. The word that marks the people who are on the boundary of community, standing on liminal religious figures, they are liminal religious figures, is moving back and forth between religious communities, thus denoting several situations of people who were considered apostates in changing circumstances for people from different religious and holding varied perspectives on the frame of religious community. But all of them disturbed by the same question of apostasy and its implication on their own group identity and boundaries. Now, it is time to conclude our short tour in the steps of Jewish apostates in the first millennium. We started with 3 questions. Each stood in the center of one meeting. The question were, what is the meaning of the Hebrew word meshumad? Is it a phenomenon? Is this phenomenon was a real one, historically recorded? And what the concept, the term apostate serves, what its implication on moral identity and community perception. So we saw that the meaning of the meshumad was changed, starting with a terrible name for those who are cursed for some reason we cannot know. The attitude toward them was harsh and definite. Later, it was changed, and apostates got some legitimacy as members of the community, though they were sinners. Under Islamic rule, the word changed ultimately and became a word of someone who joined the Islam, or maybe other religions too. The answer about the historicity of this phenomenon is complicated, and methodically it goes far beyond the specific case of Jewish apostates. We found it difficult to rely on early sources in Talmudic literature, since they are far from the events or suspected as using the word in a new way that doesn't reflect their contemporary reality. Only later, once again under Islamic period, the genre and the content teach us there was a challenging reality of people who left the community and joined the Islamic majority. We saw a phenomenon existed similarly in both Jewish and Christian communities in Mesopotamia. Today, we explored the theoretical meaning of apostasy. Until the 4th century CE, the concept was that a legal status is determined by person's deeds. On the other hand, apostates was conceptually someone who is responsible to his own acts and therefore deserves sanctions. That was changed mainly by a reshaping of Rava, the great Talmudic sage, who aided the apostates the attribute out of despite, and his re-innovating perception was adopted in certain ways by later sages. By using this edition, Rava made 2 conceptual changes. One is that the intention affects a personal status, no less than the act itself. We called it part of the mental turn. Secondly, it made the apostate out of desire as part of the community, somebody who just made an error, and not a severe sinner as before. We also added it was not an obvious moral conception, while it stands in contrast to Stoic thinking. I can add that not all Jewish sages agreed with Rava's perception of the out of desire sinner. Finally, we saw how different aspects of Jewish apostasy interacted with other cultures and religious conception in a way that demonstrate us the fluidity and flexibility of terms and concepts. I want to conclude and to thank everybody for attendance and participating, asking questions, and especially to the people in the Billionaire Center at Rutgers, to Jenny, to Sarah, Karen, and Professor Simkov for initiating and leading this mini course in highest level, in highest friendly way. I really want to thank you all, and I'm open to questions now or later by email. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a lot of, I think everyone knows who attended, a lot of complicated ideas. I do have one question. I think when most people think about apostasy, they think about conversion. And that didn't really play such a big role in what you talked about. And then that gets the question of kind of the codification of the category in a legal sense in which there's then authority to punish, right? So it's one thing if you have these Talmudic sages debating, well, the sinner or the mishumad or the mishumad out of lust or desire is worse than out of anger, and then the Marcus Aurelius and Philo have a different view. But this is like a bunch of intellectuals talking about what's worse, right? What's worse, the student who plagiarizes or the student who has chat bot write their paper, like which is worse, right? Yeah. But I'm wondering about the codification. When do we get, even within the context of a stateless, diasporic minority, when do we get the codification of these categories where there's some element of, quote, punishment of them?
When we get the codification.
Yeah. I mean, when does it go beyond, really fascinating intellectual discourse, which who doesn't like that, but, when do apostates, whoever they are, get punished? Do they get punished? Or is it a fantasy that we think they get punished? Meaning an intellectual fantasy.
Yeah, this is a great question. Actually, it is connected to the question we presented at the second session, because you are asking, so stop with this philosophical discussion and bring me to the social reality. And that was exactly the question. When was it a social reality? So as I said, as far as I understand the sources, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, doesn't reflect any social reality about apostates, and therefore I don't think that during or between the 4th or 3rd century CE to the 6th or 7th century CE, there was an apostate who was punished harshly, but it was changed meaningfully when we look at the Geonic response, because most of the discussion about apostasy is practical, is legal, and reflects social challenges. They ask about what about the get of a wife of Meshumad, or what about the get from Meshumedet for a woman who became Meshumedet, an apostate, and what about the inheritance, as I showed in the first session, and other question connected to Nichum Avelim, condolences of condolences of a father who was an apostate. So many questions arose by life, by changes of life, and some of the Jewish authorities, the Geonim, some of them kind of try to punish or to have the apostates pay on their distance they took from the Jewish community. But on the other side, there were other Geonim that thought it would not be smart to punish these apostates, and the main effort they did was to kind of attract them back to the community. So the question of punishment or delusion is the word. Certainly not.
What's the word you're looking for in Hebrew?
No, punishment and the opposite to inclusive.
Tolerance.
The opposite of tolerance.
Okay. So
anyway,
exclusion.
Exclusion. Thank you very much. The question of the practice of exclusion and punishment was in the middle of the debate between different Jewish sages, but it was a debate, an actual debate, and a social and religious debate. And since then, we find many cases, as our colleague, the head of the Jewish Studies Center, Professor Tatakov, shows many times about in the Middle Ages, there are many clashes about Jewish conversions, but it only since the early Islamic period then the conversion became something. Before that, we cannot point out any conversion as something that was has presence in Jewish life.
Okay, just to clarify, people, Professor Yoskovich is referring to the work of my colleague Paula Tartikoff, whose works on the Middle Ages as an historian and looks very closely at the mostly at the Christian West, right? The ways in which Christians and Jews interact over issues of conversion. So a couple questions before we conclude. Ian Pokris asked, Rava allowed an apostate leteavon, that is the apostate, the intentional, the apostate of desire. He was still allowed to slaughter. Did Rava also explicitly allow the rebellious Mishumad to slaughter as well? Was that also possible for that kind of Mishumad in his categorization?
Rava didn't mention the rebellious apostate at all. That is part of the reason I find it reasonable to assume that Rava didn't use or didn't think about the other concept, which is, to us, it looks like an obvious concept that fill in the rubric of the apostate out of desire, but Rava didn't think about it and didn't use it and didn't relate it legally or conceptually. So I cannot say nothing in the name of Rava. I can say that the later sages who I think innovated this concept of rebellious apostate thought that he actually debated. There is a disagreement between Rav Acha and Ravina if the rebellious apostates could or should be termed or regarded as apostates, or as something that is even more severe than apostates, which is maybe a mean or something else.
We have another question. What is the relationship between a mishumad, that term we've heard over and over again, and a person who's considered kofir ba'ikal, someone who commits kfira in Hebrew?
Great question. I thank to the questioner of this question.
That's Joe Rosenstein.
As always, thank you, Professor Rosenstein. As far as I concern, kofir ba'ikar is a different category at the early stages, and this is part of what I try to explain. That at the beginning, apostates and other terms or categories also, but I will focus on the apostate. Apostate wasn't defined by conception or thinking or intention. As we saw in the Tosefta or Rayot, they looked for the deeds, the acts that this apostate did, like he hides the circumcision and desecrates the Shabbat and so on. And kofir ba'ikar, by definition, is an intellectual, I would say more Hellenistic or more Roman intellectual category, which refers to the intellectual thinking or content that a person holds in his mind. So I don't think these two are connected at early stages. It is true, I think that in the Middle Ages already, maybe a bit earlier, many categories were mixed and were identified as kind of synonyms. And from there on, you can find somebody who relates meshumad or apostate as an epikos and rasha and or other terms that we didn't mention. But basically, there wasn't just the same. So
in the big picture summation, if we will, what we see is a kind of, you use the word liminal in your discourse, a liminal meaning not in one place and not in another, sort of a fluid identity. And what your work seems to suggest is that in the rabbinic period, even well into the Islamic years or centuries, if you will, aren't these strict the same boundaries that then seem to emerge in the medieval period, and our projection backwards to these categories or these walls or these communal divides to the early rabbinic period would be historically inaccurate in your view.
Yeah, I agree, but I want to be a bit of kind of to add a word of cautious. It doesn't mean that boundaries, at least to my opinion, that in late antique boundaries will not exist. It just to be said that the boundaries may be different and not defined religiously, so strictly religiously, as it was in the Middle Ages and later. I think that this way of defining boundaries by religious definition or belonging is kind of is a result of Christian and later Muslim conquest of other minorities. But in early times, I think there were boundaries, and boundaries were very important to people at the ancient times, and specifically for Jewish sages, but they were defined differently. And this is a word, this is a thought that I go with sometimes when I kind of trying to understand what really disturbed the sages, what's
bothering them.
And what were the reasons they did certain things and others things they ignored. So
well, without getting into the murky moment we're all living in, it's a good question to ask what's bothering contemporary people in authority, Jews in authority, about issues of boundaries. But we'll just leave that here. I want to thank you so much, Avram Yaskovich, for a very stimulating and sophisticated and at times challenging and difficult mini course. I hope those of you who are still with us will share it with your friends who maybe found it hard or didn't have the time. It will be posted on the Bildner Center website. I also want to alert you to the fact that we have two upcoming in-person events. One in February 22nd with my colleague Azan Yadin Israel, who will be presenting his research on his new book, Temptation Transformed: How the Forbidden Fruit, became the apple. And I think there too we'll see that the question of the historicity of the forbidden fruit is challenged, right? It doesn't become an apple until later. And the question is, why does it become an apple? And what's the material and visual culture and sources that he used to understand and linguistic to understand how this fruit, this ambiguous fruit, becomes an apple. So it's the larger theme is sort of the Hebrew Bible in its historical, I keep thinking in Hebrew now, it's shalavim, it's layers in history. And then in April, the esteemed biblical critic, scholar, and translator Robert Alter is coming to Rutgers. It's really it's a don't miss opportunity. Professor Alter really changed how English readers and English listeners to the Hebrew Bible understood it. He's really a giant, and the fact that he's coming in person is a real treat for all of us. So I hope you'll be able to make both of these talks, and Professor Yosowitz will be there, so you'll be able to chat with him and with other faculty in the department, as well as with me. And I always look forward to seeing people in person. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and stay tuned to the e-blasts that come from the Bildner Center, and we look forward to seeing you. Good night.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you all.